Petrified Man by Eudora, Welty.
Reach in my purse and get me a cigarette with no powder in if you can, Mrs. Fletcher, honey,
said Leota to her 10 o'clock shampoo and set customer.
I don't like no perfume cigarettes.
Mrs. Fletcher gladly reached over to the lavender shelf under the lavender-framed mirror, shook a hairnet loose from the clasp of the patent leather bag, and slapped her hand down quickly on a powder puff, which burst out when the purse was opened.
Why, look at the peanuts, Leota,
said Mrs. Fletcher in her marveling voice.
Honey, them goobers has been in my purse a week if they's been in it a day. Mrs. Pike bought them peanuts. Who's Mrs. Pike?
asked Mrs. Fletcher, settling back. Hidden in this den of curling fluid and henna packs, separated by a lavender swing door from the other customers, who were being gratified in other booths, she could give her curiosity its freedom. She looked expectantly at the black part in Leota's yellow curls as she bent to light the cigarette.
Mrs. Pike is this lady from New Orleans,
said Leota, puffing and pressing into Mrs. Fletcher's scalp with strong red-nailed fingers.
A friend, not a customer. You see, like maybe I told you last time, me and Fred and Sal and Joe all had us a fuss. So Sal and Joe up and moved out. So we didn't do a thing but rent out their room. So we rented it to Mrs. Pike and Mr. Pike.
She flicked an ash into the basket of dirty towels.
Mrs. Pike is a very decided blonde. She bought me the peanuts.
She must be cute, said Mrs. Fletcher.
Honey, cute ain't the word for what she is, I'm telling you. Mrs. Pike is attractive. She has her a good time. She's got a sharp eye out. Mrs. Pike has.
She dashed the comb through the air and paused dramatically as a cloud of Mrs. Fletcher's hennaed hair floated out of the lavender teeth like a small storm cloud.
Hair falling. Oh, Leota. Commencing to fall out,
said Leota, combing again and letting fall another cloud.
Is it any dandruff in it?
Mrs. Fletcher was frowning, her hairline eyebrows diving down toward her nose, and her wrinkled, beady-lashed eyelids batting with concentration.
Nope, she combed again. Just falling out. Bet it was that last permanent you gave me that did it, Mrs. Fletcher said cruelly. Remember, you cooked me 14 minutes. You had 14 minutes coming to you, said Leota with finality. Bound to be something, persisted Mrs. Fletcher. Dandruff. I couldn't have caught a thing like that from Mr. Fletcher, could I? Well, Leota answered at last, you know what I heard in here yesterday. One of Thelma's ladies was sitting over yonder in Thelma's booth getting a machineless, and I don't mean to insist or insinuate or anything, Mrs. Fletcher, but Thelma's lady just happened to throw out, I've forgotten what she was talking about at the time, that you was P-R-E-G. And lots of times that'll make your hair do awful funny, fall out, and God knows what all. It just ain't our fault, is the way I look at it.
There was a pause. The women stared at each other in the mirror.
Who was it?
demanded Mrs. Fletcher.
Honey, I really couldn't say,
said Leota.
Not that you look it. Where's Thelma? I'll get it out of her,
said Mrs. Fletcher.
Now, honey, I wasn't gonna get mad over a little thing like that.
Leota said, combing hastily, as though to hold Mrs. Fletcher down by the hair.
I'm sure it was somebody didn't mean no harm in the world. How far gone you?
Just wait, said Mrs. Fletcher, and shrieked for Thelma, who came in and took a drag from Leota's cigarette.
Thelma, honey, throw your mind back to yesterday, if you can,
said Leota, drenching Mrs. Fletcher's hair with a thick fluid and catching the overflow in a cold wet towel at her neck.
Well, I got my lady half wound for a spiral,
said Thelma doubtfully.
This won't take but a minute, said Leota. Who is it you got in there, old ho's face? Just cast your mind back and try to remember who your lady was yesterday, who happened to mention that my customer was pregnant. That's all. She's dead to know.
Thelma drooped her blood-red lips and looked over Mrs. Fletcher's head into the mirror.
Why, honey, I ain't got the faintest, she breathed. I really don't recollect the faintest, but I'm sure she meant no harm. I declare, I forgot my hair finally got combed and thought it was a stranger behind me. Was it Mrs. Hutchinson?
Mrs. Fletcher was tensely polite.
Mrs. Hutchinson? Oh, Mrs. Hutchinson. Thelma batted her eyes. No, precious, she come on Thursday. And didn't even mention your name. I doubt if she even know you're on the way. Thelma, cried Leota staunchly. All I know is whoever it is will be sorry someday. Why, I just barely knew it myself, cried Mrs. Fletcher. Just let her wait. Why, what are you going to do to her?
It was a child's voice, and the women looked down. A little boy was making tents with aluminum wave pinchers on the floor under the sink.
Billy boy, hon, mustn't bother nice ladies.
Leota smiled. She slapped him brightly and, behind her back, waved Thelma out of the booth.
Ain't Billy boy a sight? Only 3 years old and already just nuts about the beauty parlor business. I never saw him here before,
said Mrs. Fletcher, still unmollified.
He ain't been here before, that's how come. He belongs to Mrs. Pack. She got her a job, but it was Faye's millinery. He oughtn't to try on those ladies' hats. They come down over his eyes like I don't know what. They just get to look ridiculous. That's why, and of course, he's going to put 'em on, hats. They told Mrs. Pack they didn't appreciate him hanging around there. Here, he couldn't hurt a thing. Well, I don't like children that much, said Mrs. Fletcher. Well, said Leota moodily. Well, I'm almost tempted not to have this one, said Mrs. Fletcher. That Mrs. Hutchinson just looks straight through you when she sees you on the street and then spits at you behind your back. Mr. Fletcher would beat you on the head if you didn't have it now, said Leota reasonably, after going this far.
Mrs. Fletcher sat up straight.
Mr. Fletcher can't do a thing with me. He can't?
Leota winked at herself in the mirror.
No, sirree, he can't. If he so much as raises his voice against me, he knows good and well I'll have one of my sick headaches, and then I'm just not fit to live with. And if I really look that pregnant already, well, now, honey, I just want you to know I haven't told any of my ladies, and I ain't gonna tell 'em. Even that you're losing your hair. You just get you one of those stalk allure dresses and stop worrying. What people don't know don't hurt nobody, as Mrs. Pack says. Did you tell Mrs. Pike? Asked Mrs. Fletcher, sulkily. Well, Mrs. Fletcher, look, you ain't ever going to lay eyes on Mrs. Pike or her lay eyes on you, so what difference does it make in the long run? I knew it. Mrs. Fletcher deliberately nodded her head so as to destroy a ringlet Leota was working on behind her ear. Mrs. Pike. Leota sighed. I reckon I might as well tell you. It wasn't any more Thelma's lady told me you was pregnant than a bat. Not Mrs. Hutchinson. No, Lord, it was Mrs. Pike. Mrs. Pike. Mrs. Fletcher could only sputter and let curling fluid roll into her ear. How could Mrs. Pike possibly know I was pregnant all the while when she doesn't even know me? The nerve of some people. Well, here's how it was. Remember Sunday? Yes, said Mrs. Fletcher. Sunday, Mrs. Pike and me was all by ourselves. Mr. Pike and Fred had gone over to Eagle Lake, saying they was going to catch 'em some fish, but they didn't, of course. So we was sitting in Mrs. Pike's car. It's a 1939 Dodge. 1939, eh? Said Mrs. Fletcher. And we was getting us a Jack's beer apiece. That's the beer that Mrs. Pike says is all right, made in N.O., so she won't drink no other kind. So I seen you drive up to the drugstore and run in for just a second, leaving, I reckon, Mr. Fletcher in the car, and come running out with looked like a prescription. So I says to Mrs. Pike, just to be making talk, right yonder's Mrs. Fletcher, and I reckon that's Mr. Fletcher. She's one of my regular customers, I says. I had on a figured print, said Mrs. Fletcher, tentatively. You sure did, agreed Leota. So, Mrs. Pike, she give you a good look. She's very observant. A good judge of character, cute as a minute, you know. And she says, I bet you another Jack's that lady's 3 months on the way. What go? Said Mrs. Fletcher. Mrs. Pike. Mrs. Pike ain't gonna bite you, said Leota. Mrs. Pike is a lovely girl. You'd be crazy about her, Mrs. Fletcher, but she can't sit still a minute. We went to the Traveling Freak show yesterday after work. I got through early, 9 o'clock, in the vacant stall next door. What, ain't you been? No, I despise freaks, declared Mrs. Fletcher. Oh, well, honey, talking about being pregnant and all, you ought to see those twins in a bottle. You really owe it to yourself. What twins? Asked Mrs. Fletcher out of the side of her mouth. Well, honey, they got these 2 twins in a bottle, see? Born, joined, plumb together. They're the cause. Leota dropped her voice into a soft lyrical hum. They was about this long, must have been full-time, all right, wouldn't you say? And they had these 2 heads and 2 faces and 4 arms and 4 legs, all kind of joined here. See? This face looked this way and the other face looked that way, over their shoulder. See? Kind of pathetic. Ugh, said Mrs. Fletcher, disapprovingly. Well, ugly, honey, I mean to tell you, if their parents was first cousins and all that, Billy boy, give me a fresh towel from off Tina's stack. This one's wringing wet, and quit tickling my ankles with that color. I declare, he don't miss nothing. Me and Mr. Fletcher aren't one speck of kin, or he could never have had me, said Mrs. Fletcher, placidly. Of course not, protested Leota. Neither's me and Fred, not that we know of. Well, honey, what Mrs. Pike liked was the pygmies. They got these pygmies down there, too, and Mrs. Pack was just wild about 'em. You know, the tiniest man in the universe. Well, honey, they can just rest back on their little bohunkus and roll around, and you can't hardly tell if they're sitting or standing. That'll give you some idea. They're about 42 years old. Just suppose it was your husband. Well, Mr. Fletcher's 5'9"1/2, said Mrs. Fletcher quickly. Fred's 5'10", said Leota, but I tell him he's still a shrimp, a kind of I'm a so tall. She made a deep wave over Mrs. Fletcher's other temple with the comb. Well, these pygmies are kind of dark brown, Mrs. Fletcher. Not bad looking for what they are, you know. I wouldn't care for them, said Mrs. Fletcher. What does that Mrs. Pack see in them? Oh, I don't know, said Leota. She's just cute, that's all. But they got this man, this Petrified Man, that everything ever since he was 9 years old, when it goes through his digestion, see, somehow Mrs. Pack says it goes to his joints and has been turning to stone. How awful, said Mrs. Fletcher. He's 42 too. That looks like a bad age. Who said so? That Mrs. Pack? I bet she's 42, said Mrs. Fletcher. Nah, said Leota. Mrs. Pack's 33, born in January, an Aquarium. He could move his head like this. Of course, his head and mine ain't a joint, so to speak, and I guess his stomach ain't either. Not yet, anyways, but see, his food, he eats it, and it goes down, see, and then he digests it. Leota rose on her toes for an instant, and he goes down to his joints, and before you can say Jack Robinson, it's stone, pure stone. He's turning to stone. How'd you like to be married to a guy like that? All he can do, he can move his head just 1/4 of an inch. Of course, he looks terrible. I should think he would, said Mrs. Fletcher frostily. Mr. Fletcher takes bending exercises every night of the world. I make him. All Fred does is lay around the house like a rug. I wouldn't be surprised if he woke up one day and couldn't move. The Petrified Man just sat there, moving his 1/4 of an inch, though, said Leota reminiscently. Did Mrs. Pack like the Petrified Man? Asked Mrs. Fletcher. Not as much as she did the others, said Leota deprecatingly. And then she likes a man to be a good dresser and all that. Is Mr. Pack a good dresser? Asked Mrs. Fletcher skeptically. Oh, well, yeah, said Leota, but he's 12, 14 years older than her. She is Lady Evangeline about him. Who Lady Evangeline? Asked Mrs. Fletcher. Well, it's this mind reader they got in the freak show, said Leota. Was real good. Lady Evangeline is her name, and if I had another dollar, I wouldn't do a thing but have my palm read. She had what Mrs. Pack said was the 6th mind, but she had the worst manicure I ever saw on a living person. What did she tell Mrs. Pack? Asked Mrs. Fletcher. She told Mr. Pack was as true to her as he could be, and besides would come into some money. Humph, said Mrs. Fletcher. What does he do? I can't tell, said Leota, because he don't work. Lady Evangeline didn't tell me near enough about my nature or anything. And I would like to go back and find out some more about this boy. Used to go with this boy, got married to this girl. Oh, shoot. That was about 3.5 years ago, when you were still going to the Robert E. Lee beauty shop in Jackson. He married her for her money. Another fortune teller told me that at the time. So I'm not in love with him anymore anyway, besides being married to Fred, but Mrs. Pack thought, just for the hell of it, see, to ask Lady Evangeline, was he happy? "Does Mrs. Pack know everything about you already?" asked Mrs. Fletcher, unbelievingly. "Mercy!" "Oh, yeah, I told her everything about everything. From now on back to I don't know when, to when I first started going out," said Leota. "So I asked Lady Evangeline for one of my questions, was he happily married? And she says, just like she was glad I asked her, 'Honey,' she says, 'nah, he isn't. You write down this day, March 8th, 1941, she says, and mark it down. 3 years from today, him and her won't be occupying the same bed. There it is, up on the wall with them other dates. See, Mrs. Fletcher?' And she says, 'Child, you ought to be glad you didn't get him, because he's so mercenary.' So I'm glad I married Fred. He sure ain't mercenary. Money don't mean a thing to him. But I sure would like to go back and have my other palm read." "Did Mrs. Pack believe in what the fortune teller said?" asked Mrs. Fletcher in a superior tone of voice. "Lord, yes, she's from New Orleans. Everybody in New Orleans believes everything spooky. One of them in New Orleans, before it was raided, says to Mrs. Pack one summer she was going to go from state to state and meet some gray-headed men, and sure enough, she says she went on a beautician convention up to Chicago." "Oh," said Mrs. Fletcher. "Oh, is Mrs. Pack a beautician too?" "She sure is," protested Leota. "She's a beautician. I'm going to get her in here, if I can, before she married. But it don't leave you. She says sure enough there was 3 men who was a very large part of her making her trip what it was. And they all 3 had gray in their hair. And they went in 6 states. Got Christmas cards from them. Billy boy, go see if Thelma's got any dry cotton. Look at how Mrs. Fletcher's a dripping." "Where did Mrs. Pack meet Mr. Pack?" asked Mrs. Fletcher primly. "On another train," said Leota. "I met Mr. Fletcher, or rather, he met me, in a rental library," said Mrs. Fletcher with dignity, as she watched the net come down over her head. "Honey, me and Fred, we met in a rumble seat 8 months ago, and we was practically on what you might call the way to the altar inside of half an hour," said Leota in a guttural voice. And bit a bobby pin open. "Course it don't last. Mrs. Pack says nothing like that ever lasts. Mr. Fletcher and myself are as much in love as the day we married," said Mrs. Fletcher belligerently, as Leota stuffed cotton into her ears. "Mrs. Pack says it don't last," repeated Leota in a louder voice. "Now, go get under the dryer. You can turn yourself on, can't you? I'll be back to comb you out. During lunch, I promise to give Mrs. Pack a facial. You know, free. Her being in the business, so to speak." "I bet she needs one," said Mrs. Fletcher, letting the swing door fly back against Leota. "Oh, pardon me." A week later, on time for her appointment, Mrs. Fletcher sank heavily into Leota's chair after first removing a drugstore rental book called Life is Like That from the seat. She stared in a discouraged way into the mirror. "You can tell it when I'm sitting down all right," she said. Leota seemed preoccupied and stood shaking out a lavender cloth. She began to pin it around Mrs. Fletcher's neck in silence. "I said you can sure tell it when I'm sitting straight on and coming at you this way," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Honey, no, you can't," said Leota gloomily. "Why, I'd never know. If someone was to come up to me on the street and say Mrs. Fletcher's pregnant, I'd say, heck, she don't look it to me." If a certain party hadn't found it out and spread it around, it wouldn't be too late even now," said Mrs. Fletcher frostily. But Leota was almost choking her with the cloth, pinning it so tight, and she couldn't speak clearly. She paddled her hands in the air until Leota wearily loosened her. "Listen, honey, you're just a virgin compared to Mrs. Mountjoy." Leota was going on, still absent-minded. She bent Mrs. Fletcher back in the chair and, sighing, tossed liquid from a teacup onto her head and dug both hands into her scalp. "You know Mrs. Mountjoy? Her husband's that premature gray-headed fella." "She's in the Trojan Garden Club is all I know," said Mrs. Fletcher. "Well, honey," said Leota, but in a weary voice, "she come in here not the week before, and not the same day before she had her baby. She come in here the very self-same day. I mean to tell you, child, we was all plumb scared to death. There she was, come for her shampoo and set. Why, Mrs. Fletcher, in an hour and 20 minutes she was laying up there in the Baptist hospital with a 7-pound son. It was that close a shave, I declare. If I hadn't been so tired, I would have drank up a bottle of gin that night." "What, go," said Mrs. Fletcher. "I never knew her at all well." "See, her husband was waiting outside in the car, and her bags was all packing in the back seat, and she was all ready, sipping. She wanted her shampoo and set, and having one pain right after another. Her husband kept coming in here scared like, but couldn't do nothing with her, of course. She yelled bloody murder, too. She was always yelled her head off when I give her permanent." "She must have been crazy," said Mrs. Fletcher. "How did she look?" "Shoot," said Leota. "Well, I could guess," said Mrs. Fletcher. "Awful." "Just wanted to look pretty when she was having her baby is all," said Leota airily. "Course we was glad to give the lady what she was after, that's our motto, but I bet an hour later she wasn't paying no mind to them little end curls. I bet she wasn't thinking about she ought to have on a net. It wouldn't have done her no good if she had." "No, I don't suppose it would," said Mrs. Fletcher. "Yeah, man, she was a-yelling, just like when I give her permanent. Her husband ought to have made her behave. Don't it seem that way to you?" asked Mrs. Fletcher. "He ought to put his foot down." "Ha!" said Leota. "A lot he could do. Maybe some women is soft." "Oh, you mistake me. I don't mean for her to get soft. Far from it. Women have to stand up for themselves, or there's just no telling. But now you take me. I ask Mr. Fletcher's advice now and then, and he appreciates it, especially on something important, like it is time for a permanent, not that I've told him about the baby. He says, why, dear, go ahead, just ask their advice." Huh? If I ever asked Fred's advice, we'd be floating down the Yazoo River on a houseboat or something by this time, said Leota. "I'm sick of Fred. I've told him to go over to Vicksburg." "Is he going?" demanded Mrs. Fletcher. "Sure. See, the fortune teller, I went back and had my other palm read. Since we got to rent the room again, said my lover's going to work in Vicksburg, so I don't know who she could mean unless she meant Fred. And Fred ain't working here, that much is so." "Is he going to work in Vicksburg?" asked Mrs. Fletcher. "And sure, Lady Evangeline said so. Said the future's going to be brighter than the present. He don't want to go, but I ain't going to put up with nothing like that. Lays around the house and bulls, did bull, with that good-for-nothing Mr. Pike. He says if he goes, who'll cook? But I says I never get to eat anyway. Not meals. Billy boy, take Mrs. Grover that screen secrets and leg it." Mrs. Fletcher heard stamping feet go out the door. "Is that Mrs. Pike's little boy here again?" she asked, sitting up gingerly.
Yeah, that's still him. Leota stuck out her tongue. Mrs. Fletcher could hardly believe her eyes. Well, how's Mrs. Pack, your attractive new friend with the sharp eyes who spreads it around town that perfect strangers are pregnant? She asked, in a sweetened tone. Oh, Mrs. Pack. Leota combed Mrs. Fletcher's hair with heavy strokes. You act like you're tired, said Mrs. Fletcher. Tired? Feels like it's 4:00 in the afternoon already, said Leota. I ain't told you the awful luck we had, me and Fred. It's the worst thing you ever heard of. Maybe you think Mrs. Pack's got sharp eyes. Shoot, there's a limit. Well, you know, we rented out our room to this Mr. and Mrs. Pack from New Orleans when Sal and Joe Fentress got mad at us 'cause they drank up some home brew we had in the closet. Sal and Joe did. So, a week ago, Saturday, Mr. and Mrs. Pack moved in. Well, I kind of fixed up the room, you know, put a sofa pillow on the couch and picked some ragged robins and put in a vase, but they never did say they appreciated it. Anyway, then I put some old magazines on the table. I think that was lovely, said Mrs. Fletcher. Wait. So, come night for last, Fred and this Mr. Pack, who Fred just took up with, was back from what they say was fishing, being as neither one of them has got a job to his name, and we was all setting around in their room. So Mrs. Pack was sitting there reading an old startling G-Man tales that was mine, mind you. I bought it myself. All of a sudden, she jumps into the air. You'd have thought she sat on the spider. And says, Canfield, ain't that silly? That's Mr. Pack. Canfield, my God almighty, she says. Honey, she says, we're rich, and you won't have to work. Not that he turned one hand anyway. Well, me and Fred rushes over to her, and Mr. Pack too. And there she sits, pointing her finger at a photo in my copy of Startling G-Man. See that man, yells Mrs. Pack. Remember him, Canfield? Never forget a face, says Mr. Pack. It's Mr. Petrie that we stayed with in the apartment next to ours on Toulouse Street in N.O. for 6 weeks. Mr. Petrie? Well, says Mrs. Pack, like she can't hold on 1 second longer. Mr. Petrie's wanting for $500 cash for rapping for a woman in California. And I know where he is. Mercy, said Mrs. Fletcher. Where was he? At some time, Leota had washed her hair, and now she yanked her up by the back locks and sat her up. Know where he was? I certainly don't, Mrs. Fletcher said. Her scalp hurt all over. Leota flung a towel around the top of her customer's head. Nowhere else but in that freak show. I saw him just as plain as Mrs. Pack. He was the Petrified Man. Who would ever have thought that? Cried Mrs. Fletcher sympathetically. So, Mr. Pack says, well, what do you know about that? And he looks real hard at the photo and whistles. And she starts dancing and singing about their good luck. She meant our bad luck. I made a point of telling that fortune teller the next time I told her. I said, listen, that magazine was laying around the house for a month, and there was a $500 in it for somebody, and there was the freak show running night and day, not 2 steps away from my own beauty parlor, with Mr. Petrie just sitting there waiting, and it had to be Mr. and Mrs. Pack, almost perfect strangers. What gone? Said Mrs. Fletcher. She was only sitting there wrapped in a turban, but she did not mind. Fortune tellers don't care, and Mrs. Pack, she goes around acting like she was Mrs. God, said Leota. So, they're going to leave tomorrow, Mr. and Mrs. Pack, and in the meantime, I got to keep that mean little old kid here getting under my feet every minute of the day and talking back too.
Have they gotten the $500 reward already? Asked Mrs. Fletcher. Well, said Leota, at first Mr. Pack didn't want to do anything about it. Can you feature that? Said he kind of liked that old bird and said he was real nice to him and lent him money or something, but Mrs. Pack simply told him he could just go to hell, and I can see her point. She says, you ain't worked a lick in 6 months, and here I make $500 in 2 seconds. And what thanks do I get for it? You go to hell, Canfield, she says so. Leota went on in a despondent voice. They called up the cops, and they caught the old bird. All right there in the freak show, where I saw him with my own eyes, thinking he was petrified. He's the one. Did it under his real name, Mr. Petrie. 4 women in California, all in the month of August, so Mrs. Pye gets $500. And my magazine, and right next door to my beauty parlor. I cried on that. But Fred said it wasn't a bit of use and to go to sleep because the whole thing was just a sort of a coincidence, Can't do nothing about it. He says it pulled him clean out of the notion of going to Vicksburg for a few days till we rent out the room again. No telling who we'll get this time. But can you imagine anybody knowing this old man that's raped 4 women? Persisted Mrs. Fletcher, and she shuddered audibly. Did Mrs. Pack speak to him when she met him in the freak show? Leota had begun to comb Mrs. Fletcher's hair. I says to her, I didn't notice you falling on his neck when he was the Petrified Man. Don't tell me you didn't recognize your fine friend. And she says, I didn't recognize him with that white powder all over his face. He just looked familiar. Mrs. Pack says, and lots of people look familiar, but she says that old Petrified Man did put in her mind of somebody. She wondered who it was, kept her awake, which man she ever knew it reminded her of. So, when she seen the photo, it all come to her like a flash. Mr. Petrie, the way he turned his head and looked at her when she took him in his breakfast. Took him in his breakfast? Shrieked Mrs. Fletcher. Listen, don't tell me. I'd have felt something. 4 women. I guess those women didn't have the faintest notion at the time they'd be worth $125 apiece someday to Mrs. Pack. We asked her how old the fellow was then, and she said he must have had 1 foot in the grave at least. Can you beat it? Not really petrified at all, of course, said Mrs. Fletcher meditatively. She drew herself up. I'd have felt something, she said proudly. Shoot, I did feel something, said Leota. I told Fred when I got home I felt so funny. I said, Fred, that old Petrified Man sure did leave me with a funny feeling. He says, funny ha-ha or funny peculiar. I says, funny peculiar. She pointed her comb into the air emphatically. I bet you did, said Mrs. Fletcher. They both heard a crackling noise. Leota screamed, Billy boy, what you doing in my purse? Oh, I'm just eating those old stale peanuts up, said Billy boy. You come here to me, screamed Leota, recklessly flinging down the comb, which scattered a whole ashtray full of bobby pins and knocked down a roll of Coca-Cola bottles. This is the last straw. I caught him, giggled Mrs. Fletcher. I hold him on my lap. You bad, bad boy, you. I guess I better learn how to spank little old bad boys, she said. Leota's 11 o'clock customer pushed open the swing door, upon Leota paddling him heartily with the brush, while he gave angry but belittling screams, which penetrated beyond the booth and filled the whole curious beauty parlor. From everywhere ladies began to gather round to watch the paddling. Billy Boy kicked both Leota and Mrs. Fletcher as hard as he could.
Mrs. Fletcher, with her new fixed smile.
Damn, my little man, gasped Leota. You won't be able to sit down for a week if I knew what I was doing.
Billy Boy stomped through the group of wild-haired ladies and went out the door, but flung back the words,
If you're so smart, why ain't you rich?